Well, let's get you more perspective now on the trade talks and their potential outcomes. I'm joined live from Irvine, California by Dan McClory, Managing Director and Head of China for Boustead Securities. Always good to have you on, Dan.
Thanks, Rachelle.
Now, ahead of the talks, the rhetoric really indicated that expectations weren't that high. But now on day one, we have President Trump saying the talks are going very well. What are your thoughts on how all this is unfolding?
Well, it's obviously unfolding in real time, and there's a whole confluence of events that are taking place. And I think we really do have to look at it as incrementalists. We have to look at, number one, these talks even taking place. There was some rumor that they weren't going to happen. Number two, the Chinese delegation was rumored to potentially be leaving on Thursday and not even sticking around for Friday. Well, they're actually going to stay. At least the vice premier will stay to meet with President Trump. So that's a positive. And then, as Mr. Trump is known to do, the statements that he makes and the indications that he gives are oftentimes very telling. So I don't think he would be saying, it's really good, we've made a lot of progress, unless his ministers had briefed him that that was the case. So, you know, we just got to keep reading, no pun intended, the tea leaves every day, and as incrementalists, take that into consideration. I think something to add on to the report from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange is the fact that futures have, of course, already opened, and they're up, all three indices, the Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ. Those futures are all up in anticipation of something positive occurring tomorrow.
And we know that there are some business leaders in that delegation. So tell us what the size and the scope of the delegations tell us about the significance of this 13th round of trade talks and perhaps their priorities going in.
That's a really good one, Rachelle. And I guess I would start by saying, you know, about 10 days ago on the 27th of September, a high-level U.S. delegation, including the business leaders you're talking about, people from Goldman Sachs and Blackstone, went and they actually met in Beijing, and they met with the head of the central bank, which is Mr. Gong. And they actually started talking about the opening up of financial markets, which is a whole nother theme that the U.S. financial services industry has high on their agenda. So you've got folks like that. I think it's very notable that Mr. Gong is also a part of the delegation with Li He, and that they have seen fit to bring the A-team to Washington. And I think it's been responded to in kind with, you know, Steve Mnuchin, as well as Lighthizer being, you know, the point people for the U.S. So you've got the right folks in the room. At least you had them in the room today for, as we heard from your correspondent, the better part of 8 hours. And the fact that some of the higher level guys are sticking around for tomorrow, I think bodes really well.
Now, we know there's also been some talk of some sort of mini deal. Do we know what that might entail, or perhaps which industries might be involved?
We do. And again, Rachelle, if you and I had this all figured out, we'd probably be doing different things because we would know in advance what's going to happen. But we can interpret what we're hearing. And the script for the mini deal, the partial deal, the interim deal, as it's being called by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, runs as follows. We've got a kind of a proxy for this, and this was what occurred between the U.S. and Japan recently. It's lead with agriculture and have some almost pre-agreed aspects that could immediately come to the fore. And so the agricultural lead between China and the U.S. first and foremost involves soybeans, where it's rumored that they will be increased on an annual basis from a 50% increase from 20 million tons, to 30 million tons. That's about a $6.25 billion increase in terms of opening up that market to U.S. farmers. The second one we've heard, also agriculture related, has to do with meat. So it has to do with pork, beef, and lamb. And that has to do not with any punitive tariffs or reductions of amounts that are allowed to be exported, but it really has to do with the very detailed process that China's equivalent of the FDA uses, China's equivalent of the USDA uses in order to allow those products to be cleared to come into the country. So there's something like 60 minor restrictions that are being rumored to be reduced, which would make it easier for those products to come from the U.S. into China.
And just quickly, Dan, we know that the talks are obviously happening as a U.S. tariff hike on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods is set to go into effect on October 15th. There's also a 15% tariff on almost all remaining goods on December 15th. How likely are we to see those go into effect?
I think we're not. I think it's not likely they'll go into effect. I think based on the expected progress for tomorrow, that's going to get pushed out to December. And I think the big interim event, which is in November in Chile, when the APEC gets together, and hopefully Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi get to sit down face to face and come up with the real deal, the bigger deal, maybe the final deal.
All right, always good to see you. Dan McClory there, Managing Director and Head of China at Boustead Securities.